I am going to start welcoming everyone to today's Behavioral Science and AI global webinar on the synergy powering financial services, innovation, and growth. I am super excited to be here with you today. I checked the registrations list before logging on, and it is amazing to see from the registrations that this is truly a global webinar. I was excited to see people dialing in from Australia to Singapore, South Africa to Angola, Spain to Bulgaria, the UAE to Turkey, and all the way from Brazil to Canada. I have not mentioned every single country that has logged in, but I just want to acknowledge and thank you for making the effort despite the difference in time zones. Additionally, we have a wide variety of attendees. We have representatives from every single domain in financial services, including cap markets, insurance, banking and payments, and wealth and asset management. Additionally, we have representatives from academia, behavioral science practitioners, students, and I cannot wait to get started because our panel represents people based in London all the way to New York. Moving on to the next slide, I think it's time to start with the introductions. So because of this breadth of experiences, we would like to start by level setting to make sure that we're on the same page, because there's people that are experts in behavioral science and AI, but maybe some of you just logged in because you're interested. Before we do that, let me introduce myself officially. My name is Martha, and I am the lead for Capco's behavioral science practice. I drive large transformation programs in financial services, where in addition to addressing methodology and technology aspects, I focus on the people dimension. To do that, I design behavioral interventions that can improve employees and clients' decision-making and outcomes. And to stay on top of this dynamic field, I am currently studying an executive master's in behavioral science at the London School of Economics, LSE. Now I will hand over to my co-chair, Charlotte, for her to introduce herself.
Thanks, Martha, and hi all, thanks for joining today. I lead Gen AI for Capco, and I've been working in AI for just over 10 years now, so long before it was as smart as it is today. I work with all of our clients across the spectrum, from establishing AI strategies and governance frameworks to identifying opportunities for AI to building out solutions end to end to unlock that value. While I'm no behavioral science expert, it plays a huge role in AI and the success and value creation. And this is only going to continue to grow as we move forward and evolve on this AI journey. So really looking forward to this panel today.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlotte. So let's get started with the introduction. Let's start with behavioral science and let's go to the basics. What is behavioral science? My favorite, in a nutshell definition, is that behavioral science covers several disciplines that explain how and why people make decisions. And let's stop there for a second. It sounds simple, but how and why people make decisions? Do you even know how many decisions human beings make on average per day? It's not a couple, it's not two digits, it's 35,000. That covers everything from like snooze, don't snooze when the alarm goes off, to shall I invest in AI adoption within my company? What should I leverage for AI to maybe take on for me so I can have time to focus on higher value add activities? So hopefully you're starting to get a picture of we cannot possibly compute all 35,000 decisions consciously. So many of these decisions are made subconsciously. So let me explain this quick diagram. At the center, you'll see a brain and a heart. The brain represents the rational decision-making and conscious decision-making. The heart represents the emotional decision-making, which some people might even call irrational. The umbrella of behavioral science covers different disciplines to explain this complexity on how we make those decisions. So the brain represents what behavioral science calls systems 2 thinking, which is slow rational, and it takes more time and effort, but usually yields higher quality decisions and better outcomes. So as a quick example, imagine you're deciding to adopt AI. From an economical perspective, you would analyze the utility. So what is the return of investment from the money that you would spend on a monthly subscription? How much value would you get out of that? So that takes time. You would come up with an analysis and then make a decision. However, in reality, you might make a faster decision with emotion, a gut feeling. So the disciplines that could represent that type of decision would sit within psychology, sociology, and neuroscience. A quick example would be sociology. We want to fit in. So we would maybe make a quicker decision based on what our team is doing. Is everyone in my team already implementing the use of AI? Or are they actually more careful and they're saying, no, that's a fad, I'm not ready for that. Let's stick to our good old ways of making decisions. Moving on, I would like to bring this to life in the financial services world. So all of you either work in financial services or you're a client. So you might be aware that financial services is rapidly adopting tooling and automation to reshape how we work with a methodology. But what the diagram is representing is that all change starts and finishes with people. People would make the decision of we need a new tool to upgrade or automate. That will then change the methodology. But the point I'm trying to raise here is that in the end, it also ends with people, because if people don't choose to adopt that new methodology or technology, the change is not going to be embedded and we're not going to see any behavioral change. Moving on, the following slide introduces the concept of behavioral biases. I would like to stop for a second. If you're not familiar with this term, you probably have heard the word bias, you're biased. And usually that correlates to being stereotypical regarding gender or maybe race. That is actually worth mentioning for a second. That is part of the subconscious decision making that makes our decision making faster. I mentioned system 2. System 1 is the one that is fast, and it could rely on these mental shortcuts, but sometimes there's a systematic error. And because humans have coded AI, we have passed on that bias to AI. This specific one about gender and culture or race has been addressed, or at least to a big degree. It's an ongoing challenge. But today I want to highlight other type of behavioral biases that are cognitive, and they apply to both humans and AI, because again, we created AI. I'm not going to cover all of these examples. If you're interested, please put your questions in the Q&A. We will get to them at the end following the panel. As a quick example, I would like to highlight present bias, for instance. As a human, if you haven't engaged with AI or any other LLM, you might go, oh my gosh, I don't even know how to register. I wouldn't even know where to start. So we prioritize immediate gratification. The effort of signing up is too big and you wouldn't see the benefit today. But if we understand these behavioral biases, we're able to design AI and the adoption strategy better so we can enable it. So we would need to highlight to our employees what is the long-term return or actually medium-term and how we can support them to see the benefit realizing. I will touch on the other ones slightly on the next slide, but conscious of time, moving on to my final one. Here, I thought that we wouldn't have made justice to behavioral science if I didn't wrap up with behaviors. So what are the behaviors that I would suggest we lean into for successful AI adoption, personally and within our companies? First off, I would like to highlight, we must experiment. That is the science in behavioral science. You need to experiment first with light adoption, but then going into deep adoption, understanding not only what we can automate immediately, but how can we use AI to make better decisions that lead to better outcomes. That leads to challenge. That is about speaking up and not just taking whatever AI tells us as the oracle. It is a co-pilot. It could be wrong. So challenging the answers that we get, going deeper, testing different ways of asking the same question to see if we get a different answer, testing and challenging if it aligns with our reality and our context. And finally, collaborate with friends, colleagues, share your lessons learned, because that is the storytelling that helps us identify where the biggest value of AI is. And of course, use the behavioral insights to monitor how these behaviors are embedded. Now, I will hand over to Charlotte so she can cover the introduction from an AI perspective.
Thanks, Martha. When we look across financial services, the speed and interest in AI and innovation more broadly is continuing to move at pace. But what we're hearing a lot more about from clients and across industry is value. And unlocking real value only comes when the technology sticks and adoption is successful. And what we see as some of the biggest blockers to success and value are often not technical, but behavioral, and tying back to that behavioral science lens. If we take a look, as Martha, you touched on in your slide, I won't cover all of these, so do feel free to ask questions in the chat, but I will pull out some of them to focus in on. If you take siloed adoption, we have teams that are experimenting still in isolation. They're running really great proof of concepts in one part of the business, but they're not spreading into other areas. And often that's not a data or infrastructure problem. It's about the trust and change problem within the organization for being able to expand it. Tied to this, there's a huge gap between the number of pilots that are happening across the industry and the number of use cases that are moving into production. Many firms, and what we see across our client base, are really brilliant at running pilots, but scaling them often means that people have to actually change how they work day to day, what they do within an individual process. And that can be very uncomfortable for people. And it's a real behavioral shift, not just a technical one, that we see as one of the blocks through to that production phase across the industry. If we look at risk, sensitivity, and regulation, this is another layer. Financial services is obviously a heavily regulated industry, and explainability of decisions is paramount. We need to be able to explain why certain decisions were made, and AI isn't always built for that, and it has a black box element, as some would see it. And you're really starting from a space of high complex regulation, and then when you start to layer in AI regulation and different AI regulation within different regions, it becomes quite nuanced and complex global challenge for a lot of large enterprises. And if we look at it, in financial services, the cost of getting it wrong is high, and therefore a natural bias towards caution. However, that can create a laggard mindset, and it's a real need to balance that caution with the appetite to innovate and move forward as well. And I think finally on this one, customer expectations, there's been a big shift in the past 2 years on customer expectations from financial services institutions. An example here being, hyper-personalization. Customers expect that AI is able to access their data in real time, to give them insights. They expect that their banks knows them better than they do in some ways in terms of the products that they need. And they expect to be offered custom products and services to match those needs. So from custom mortgage packages to bespoke insurance cover that are custom to the individual, that's moved from, a forward front mover to an increasing baseline expectation of customers. However, for organizations, that's a real balance between innovation with data, privacy, fairness, and going back to that explainability element. So what we see across these challenges as behavioral science playing a real key role in helping us to understand how to navigate some of them, and in helping us being able to build that trust and confidence in using AI responsibly to really scale it across the industry. If we move on and we kind of take that look of expansion, once firms get past experimentation, the real challenge is scaling, moving on from pilots to AI being part of how the business operates day to day. And, in parts, that journey is absolutely about the technology, the data, and everything that sits behind it. But it's also hugely about trust, behavior, and governance. At first, we typically see organizations run those isolated pilots. They're small and safe. Then comes the industrialization, where these use cases start to connect at scale. But ultimately, the end goal is an AI-infused business as usual, where AI quietly supports decisions within the organization day to day. We don't talk about how the internet helps us in work every day. It just is. And that's the trajectory of AI and an AI-infused ecosystem that we see for the financial services. But to get there, on the right-hand side, you'll see some of the kind of key enablers to achieve that. So robust governance being one, in order to build that confidence and to ensure the responsible use of it. Training and responsible AI frameworks to help people understand what's under the hood and therefore how they can use it safely and effectively. And I think the final point on this is really crucial one: leadership support, leading by doing, and smart incentives. Behavior follows what is rewarded, and seeing leadership set that example from the forefront really is where we see some of the most successful transformations today. And moving on to my final slide in this space is around AI adoption and the personas that we're seeing across our client base within financial services. It's one of my favorite lenses to look at in terms of identifying where people are on their journey or where their organization is placed. I would say there is no persona that is necessarily better than the other. They all come with different risk-reward elements. Innovators, they are often the fintechs or digital first banks. They're moving fast, they're experimenting openly and talking about what they're doing. We then have those fast followers, which I would say is the majority of the large incumbents, where they wait for potentially clear regulation and frameworks to be provided, and they look to follow proven models of success before they look to scale at pace. And then finally, on the right-hand side, we have the guardians, which is where I would say a lot of financial service organizations by default felt towards, back at the launch of ChatGPT over 2 years ago. This is where you really prioritize control and compliance and ensuring that AI fits within a very strict governance boundary. As you can see, I suppose there's that tension between speed and safety, which is constant for financial service organizations. Innovation without guardrails is risky, but too much caution can often kill innovation. And that can have a detrimental impact to financial service organizations who need to remain competitive and provide the right offering to their customers in order to stay relevant. So behavioral science really plays a huge role in managing that and the cultural divide that we see across organizations today.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Charlotte. Before we move on to the panel discussion, quick reminder, if you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A. I actually got one. I mentioned LLM and I forgot to describe it. LLM stands for Large Language Model, and in simple terms is artificial intelligence trained on massive amounts of text to understand and generate human-like language, like ChatGPT, Claude, Gemini, etc. So with no further ado, let me introduce the rest of our panel. I'll start with Liam. So I'm super proud of this panel. We have representatives from academia, the industry, and consulting. Representing academia, we have Professor Liam Delaney. Liam is head of the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. He's a leading voice in the field. He's a widely published author and has co-developed the For Good ethical framework to embed trustworthy behavioral practice. We're delighted to have him here with us today. Thank you, Liam. for being here. Next, I'd like to welcome Jeff Chrysler to our panel. Jeff is the head of behavioral science at JP Morgan Private Bank, where he helps clients understand how emotions and biases shape financial decisions. He's also a best-selling author, an award-winning comedian, and a global thought leader in applied behavioral science. We're delighted to have him here with us today. Thank you, Jeff, for being here. Now, on to the main event, the panel. To kick things off, I am going to ask a question to Charlotte and Liam that directly links into the title of the global webinar. Let's start with Charlotte, Liam. How can behavioral science and AI help financial services institutions tackle systemic challenges of productivity, profitability, and global competition?
Great, thank you, Martha, and hello, everyone. So, yeah, I'm the head of the Department of Behavioral Science in LSE, and we spend a lot of time with executives like Martha and others working on these topics. And we've developed a framework with many folks from the industry looking at ethical ways of introducing behavioral science into industry and regulatory applications. So the types of things I'm finding interesting, and I try to stay out of this more wild claims about general intelligence and those sort of things. And I think some of there's a lot of speculation about AI, and I think what we all need to do is find practical use cases that can be evaluated in the normal way. And where I'm seeing promise would be firstly in the capacity to develop information. I'm on part of the committee at the moment looking at how you use AI to develop systematic reviews if you're exploring options. And I can talk more about that, but it's absolutely fascinating the direction that's going. Certainly can't do it unsupervised, but it can augment humans in a really interesting way. I think for industry was already getting quite good at analyzing natural language data, but certainly a lot of the folks we work with here are moderately excited about the role of AI in particularly things like complaints data, customer review data, in augmenting traditional natural language and turning it into genuine conversations with consumers that could lead to, for example, adequate resolution of complaints, building of lifelong relationships, and so on. And we can talk. I don't want to take up loads of time, but like the personalization and the development of things like lifelong financial education, lifelong tailored financial investment. Again, is there hard evidence that people are absolutely nailing it on that? Absolutely not. Are there like use cases that are starting to look promising? Definitely yes. So I think that's where we are with a lot of those. You're starting to see stuff that is doable. You can see how it will be done. So the question is, when you evaluate and scale it, like what will turn out to be the most effective? And I guess that's what we're talking about today.
Yeah, and I think, Martha, from our side, when I'm talking to clients and we talk about productivity and profitability, AI often takes center stage, talking about, automating repetitive tasks, finding efficiencies across the organization, and really that kind of AI operating shift. And I would say that AI gives them the first step in terms of the capability to move faster, for sure, but behavioral science gives them that capacity. So it's all about helping people to adopt and trust those tools. As I kind of touched on previously, the AI alone won't solve for or create the value for FS clients or for any industry. So it's all about that transformation piece. I had an example on a client where they was working with a team and building and rolling out an AI solution, and the team themselves where the tool would be used, they didn't want to use the AI tool because they feared it would replace their judgment and their SME knowledge, and or even them. There was that kind of uncertainty where they weren't brought in early on as part of the program. But once that narrative changed, and through that kind of change management program, and working with them and reframing it as a tool to support them rather than replace them, adoption jumped almost overnight. So together, the narrative matters. AI drives performance, but people drive that participation and ultimate value. And I think that that's a really key message as well.
That was a great answer. Thank you, both of you. I think for all of us working in financial services, doing more with less has been a standard that is here to stay. Every year, we're being asked to cut costs, and deliver to a higher standard. So maybe that's how AI can help us if we implemented it wisely, as we mentioned, aligned to our strategy, our culture, and with the right governance. Great kickoff for our conversation. Let's now go to our second question, directed to Jeff and Liam. How can our audience leverage behavioral science and AI to improve how they work day to day? Liam, would you like to start?
Sure. I mean, following from what I said, I think it's really finding within a very noisy, and what's happening at the moment, I think some of the wider noise around AI is distracting, and it's leading to firms, delaying decisions. And I think we have to kind of drown out some of that as much as we can and focus on the practical applications. I've mentioned some of them already. Like, I definitely think any financial firm with lots of consumer data should be looking at the potential for AI to use some of that in things like personalization of advice, or particularly complaint resolution. I'm excited by some of the stuff that's happening with synthetic customers as a way of looking at ethical ways of experimentation, for example. I mean, things that you would think of sometimes in terms of behavioral science. Can you do experiments? And again, I think that's still relatively, it's not that early that it shouldn't be tried, if you know what I mean. It's just not so advanced that it's got standardized use, but certainly using synthetic customers to go through vastly complicated administrative processes to see where vulnerabilities might be or leverage points for building financial stability. I find a lot of those very, very practical areas. And I also think we've seen cases recently where people have had to retract reports because they used AI in a clumsy way to generate like mountains of text that they don't understand. So there's clearly vulnerabilities there. But I think if you understand what you're doing, and I know it's a glib thing to say, but I genuinely feel this, that AI is augmenting the capacity of people with high levels of knowledge to take vast amounts of information and make it accessible to people. Whereas, and I'll talk about the ethical issues, I think if you remove the human supervision and the structure of the expertise and you just have mountains of text that people don't understand, that's where you're seeing the retractions and the embarrassments and so on. I think augmenting human knowledge with the capacity is, I think there's already practical use cases there.
Yeah. Thanks, Liam. First of all, thanks for having me, everyone. I appreciate the opportunity. And just building a little bit off of what Liam was saying, this idea of the noise or how overwhelming AI feels right now. I'm driven by the sort of general behavioral science approach that context matters. Context matters. Like your personal context, your firm's context, who are you serving, what is their situation, like loss aversion and present bias are wonderful terms, but you give someone a hammer and everything looks like a nail. You can't just approach it. So get yourself narrowed and focused. And within that realm, as regards AI, I think it's really important right now to eliminate some of the noise by focusing on AI as a tool, not a solution. It's a tool, not a solution. Right? We're not near the time when there's going to be a hologram of a financial advisor that walks you through your day. That may come someday, but right now it is a tool to help the people that are still vital in financial services deliver for their clients and help the clients make better decisions that ultimately serve their goals. One of the contexts for my particular role is I focus more on sort of advisor-driven relationships, less on direct consumer digital interfaces. And there's similarities in both, but for me, it's very clear that the people still matter. And when I think about how we might use AI and the advice to others, how they might think about it, I like to fall back on this very simple concept that when someone interacts with a financial advisor, be they a person or digital tool, they don't want to leave that interaction becoming an expert in financial advice. They don't want to know everything. They want to leave that interaction and turn to their partner and say, I feel good about that. I trust that person. I feel like we're in good shape. I can relax a little bit. And sometimes we have an over-reliance on let's get the data and the technical and the financial. Let's get all the information to them, which AI can really do great. And we forget about that feelings. So, I'm obviously biased because my focus is the behavioral science and the connection to people. But I would say as we barrel into developing AI in financial services, let's not lose sight of how it's going to be used and that very important context of what our clients in the end really want and need.
That was fantastic. Thank you, Jeff and Liam, for not only highlighting how behavioral science can influence AI, but what can AI do for behavioral science, which is exactly the synergy that we're here to talk about. Now, let's move on to individual questions and put Charlotte on the hot seat. So, Charlotte, in your experience as Capco's Gen AI global lead, how do trust and human behavior affect client adoption of AI in financial services?
Thanks, Martha. And I think I touched on this a little bit earlier, but trust is fundamentally the backbone of the financial service industry. And really, it's the same when it comes to AI. In many, many cases, adoption doesn't fail because the technology doesn't work. It fails because people don't trust the technology, or they don't trust themselves to be able to use the technology correctly. And understandably, kind of people are hesitant to use AI when it's producing insights that they can't explain or that they don't understand themselves. And that's why creating that trust element through transparency and explainability within models and solutions are key. And that's something that we really focus on with our clients when we're building out those AI solutions to be used at scale, is how and where can you put those checkpoints through and have that explainable AI piece built in? Because where you are able to achieve that, the overall success of the solution adoption is significant. You know, people to some degree, they need to see and feel, almost touch, to understand what they are using and what they will be relying on from the AI tool. Things like being able to override the output, for instance, and having that editable functionality for human in the loop checking, and being part of the design discussions early on when you as an organization are building something net new in AI that you expect to be leveraged by your people. Bringing them in early and having SMEs part of the system design has a huge impact in building the trust, because it builds the understanding early. And again, as we've kind of touched on, is the leadership models and setting the right behaviors from the top down will set a huge precedent within an organization, and a huge path for people within that organization to follow, where they feel they are kind of following a trodden path rather than being the pure risk taker themselves. You know, and ultimately in the end, trust is, you know, about that human reassurance and making sure that people understand what you're asking of them.
Thank you. That was great, Charlotte. And I do find trust fascinating, especially when applied to adoption. We were chatting and I shared that you can measure trust in 3 different dimensions: competence of the person providing advice, benevolence, do they care about you, but also integrity, is that advice aligned with the values? So that's where we need the governance of our organization to show that we do care about our employees. As Jeff said, it's just a tool. So it's our job to set up the guardrails for us to trust in that new tool. Okay, so that's a nice segue to my next question, where we're putting now Liam on the hot seat. So Liam, as a co-founder of For Good, I think you have a great insight to answer this. What ethical concerns arise when AI is used to design or scale behavioral interventions? Are recent regulations likely to mitigate these risks?
Wow, that's a small question. In terms of the broad macro picture, what Charlotte said is right, and many technologies, whether it's GM foods, nanotechnology, and so on, can get completely disrupted in ways that people within the industry find it hard to comprehend by a lack of public trust. And AI will go through that phase now, that regardless of the sort of sterile environment use cases where you can develop something in a small sample or a lab or something, but once it hits the public consciousness, then trust in institutions and the human sociality of it. And it goes back to what Jeff was saying. I mean, you know, we already have index funds. In some sense, there's whole chunks of the financial industry that shouldn't exist, but exists because people want a human connection with people that they can trust and people that they can delegate some element of decision making to. But we know from many literatures that requires likability, it requires trust, it requires some sort of sense of adhering to an institution that you feel respects some elements of your values. And AI could disrupt that in bad ways, right? There's ways in which that could go wrong. And I think that's a macro societal issue that we could talk about. And a very practical issue, and I know people would be frustrated by the fact that AI encapsulates a lot of things, like we're bundling predictive analytics with, you know, LLMs and all of this. But I think on the analytics side, hyper-personalization is clearly an issue. And it's covered by things like the EU Safety Act, and there's also all sorts of regulations around privacy. But I think that bit will work out however it works. But it's how people use that behavioral power. It's whether it's used in ways that become predictably leading. Like, for example, if you get better at encouraging choices that lead to post-decision regret, like I'll be looking at a lot of that really closely. And I don't mean from a regulatory perspective, I just think from an interest perspective. And I would say the idea of LLM sycophancy, I know it's something a lot of people have been looking at, but some colleagues here have a paper coming out in Science which shows it's almost linear, almost like the way as it gets better at computing power, it gets better able to produce text. LLMs are also becoming more persuasive, and you will have pathways where it'll talk really knowledgeably and really happily about gold prices or whether you should invest in crypto or whatever. And that creates a real challenge, right? Because it's going to be very good at persuading people down all sorts of directions, and how companies embed that and how they put a human supervision on that to reflect what they're doing in a regulatory context and in line with their values becomes crucial to whether, for example, you can let chatbots loose. And sorry, the final thing I should have said is the authenticity of text. So the production of knowledge, like that is an issue we're going through right now, and you're seeing it in the financial papers all the time. People are producing text they don't understand and having to basically repudiate them at massive cost of reputation and so on. That's an ethical issue, it's a reputational issue, but it's one we're all dealing with in some ways. It produces lovely text, cuts out loads of work, but we expect people to know what they're talking about and have had some role in understanding what they're writing. And I think that's a big one at the moment.
Thank you. I know that was a huge question, but you did great providing some insight, Liam. I completely agree. It's like the traceability to understand what advice was given and why, and that would be key for the regulator, because as Jeff was saying, it's still just a tool. It cannot replace the decision making from human beings. So if we put forward a decision from AI or LLMs and humans cannot back it up and the organization goes ahead with it, that's when we get in trouble. So traceability will be key, understanding why that decision was put forward and challenging it. Okay, so Jeff, it's your moment to be on the hot seat. So in your current role at JP Morgan, looking at private bank with the behavioral science lens, what do you think are the biggest challenges and opportunities in incorporating AI into behavioral science in FS? Which behaviors could benefit the most in this approach?
Thank you. And just like Liam, it's a big question, but I'll try to do my best to give a short answer. And I'll say this, that I have my own personal bias. I tend to be a late adopter to technology. I tend to be a whoa, slam on the brakes, like let's hesitate. So I'm going to sort of lean into the opposite of that and start with the positive things, the positive opportunities. I think there are a lot. I'll get to my hesitancy, of course, afterwards. And to sort of oversimplify, I think that if AI can tackle the technical and even the financial work, it's going to free up the people to do the personal work. And as I said before, ultimately, like financial advice is not just about numbers. It's about getting people to feel like they're in a good place, to trust, as we mentioned, to move forward. And that's both for the clients in the end, as well as the internal employees and advisors and people that work, that trusting the tool. So I think that we see in popular culture people complaining, oh, I thought AI was going to take my boring tasks so I could write poetry, and now it's writing poetry. I think that's just early stages. And I do think that in the financial services, AI is going to help us with a lot of the technical and financial things that overwhelm us to allow us to write the poetry, which, if I can make it beautiful financial services, is what we can offer. And I think that within that, if we look a couple steps forward, it's focusing on the intention action gap, which is essentially the real challenge within behavioral science. It isn't necessarily a lack of knowledge. It's a lack of being able to move beyond decision points because we're stuck, or we move beyond them based upon these biases you mentioned earlier, which may not serve us. And I like to think that where I've seen it have the most potential impact is at sort of change moments, when an external force, tariffs, an invasion of a country, a market movement, a new development in tools in AI, even, where external forces sort of impact our perspective on our financial future, as well as internal ones, life events. I'm a parent. I'm retiring. I got an inheritance. I'm selling my business. I just started a business. These are the moments where I see people most stuck, that we can have reams of data and advice and numbers that say this is what you should do, but that doesn't mean we do it. The intention action gap is so great because we can know the right thing, we can understand the right choice, but something is hesitant. That's where behavioral science really can come in, and that's where I think AI can complement those advisors and those people that are essentially trying to coach others to making the best decisions. Because if AI can help the advisors sort of simplify the work they have to do to get this technical and find out all this information together, and they can make that simple to deliver as a complement to the personal side, to the coaching, the connection, the addressing the fears and concerns and excitement that their client may have. The financial services industry is people that work here are so overwhelmed on a daily and yearly basis with everything from knowing how to analyze numbers to new regulations, everything else, that I'm constantly impressed at their ability to continue doing their job. But I believe that AI can help us alleviate some of that pressure by perhaps lessening some of that load. Again, tool, not a solution, a tool to help simplify things. For instance, I picture a world where what was it? Within AI, remember DeepSeek came out with some new technology earlier this year, and it threw everybody off. Now, what if when the next version of DeepSeek new technology comes out, you're sitting there and you have a book of 100 or 200 clients, and you have to think, okay, who reacted a certain way to DeepSeek before, and how to if AI can help sort that out, that saves you an hour and a half of looking through your book to figure out who to call, and you can just make those calls. So that's where I think AI can really help things. When I think then further about the ways that we can be positive, and to your point, the behavioral biases that are most likely benefit, I think about things like sunk cost and anchoring and regret aversion. Liam, you sort of got towards that, and loss aversion. These things that kind of get we're at the verge of making that choice of leaping over the intention action gap, but we're held back. And if AI, again, can help the advisors make the personal connection, and I'm not saying push people across that gap, but help them focus on the things that really matter, I think that's a benefit. On the sort of the hesitancy side, or the challenges, I think of 4 challenges. The data, nuance, and empathy and trust. I guess the last 2 are essentially one together. The data remains a challenge in a lot of ways, because while banks have amazing data, I imagine it's a bit of a mess when we think about how do we feed it then through AI and into advice. It's a mess because there are regulations, right? You can't keep a lot of the information that we may have. PII, those in the industry know, personal identifying information. There's just so many rules around. I'm not saying eliminate the rule. Let me be clear, that's not what I'm saying. But I'm saying there's so many reasons why the data is promising, but at the moment is messy. And beyond that, even if we had clean data all the time, what is the accuracy of that data, and what is the relevancy of that data to these decisions? I think that we sometimes can have an over-reliance on the data providing the answer, the data science, but being absent of the people science, the data providing, for instance, personas and personalities. And I am not anti those, but I'm hesitant in those. And I always think of one of my favorite images that's passed around is it shows two gentlemen, both male, born in 1948, raised in the United Kingdom, married twice, living in a castle, and wealthy. That's great data. You should treat them the same. However, one of them is King Charles and one of them was Ozzy Osbourne. Should you give them the same financial advice? No, right? And that sort of leads to the relevancy data transitioning to the nuance involved. The fact that at the moment, AI is, again, it gets us far, but people still need to understand that nuance. And there may be a day when the holograms of AI can provide that, but right now we're very far from that. Understanding, are you talking to Ozzy Osbourne or are you talking to King Charles? And connected again to that is this question of empathy and trust. There was an interesting study from, I think it was through Harvard, a gentleman talked about how so many people are using AI now for therapy, which I kind of found shocking. Why would you trust AI? But people are doing it. But what's interesting to me is they were confessing and asked, hey, I'm thinking about having this trouble with my marriage, or all these, like, to a certain extent. But then once the AI attempted to empathize and say, I understand how you feel, then the trust was broken, right? Then they were like, I know, you don't, right? They confessed all these things, and I think I'll be real quick, and I just think that there's something that remains in that human element, that I worry that we will attempt to have AI empathize, when that's still a role for people with real nuance and understanding.
That was great. Thank you so much for making it so relatable and insightful by bringing in all of these examples, Jeff. Quick reminder regarding the Q&A, you don't see it, click on the three dots that say more, and then you would see that feature. We have a grand finale question for the panel, and then we will move on to the Q&A. So for all participants, we don't need to hear from everyone, but if you have your 2 final cents, how can our audience build the skills, stay relevant as behavioral science and AI reshape the future of work?
I mean, I'm happy to, I'll jump in and start there. I think it might be slightly cliche, this one, but it's kind of being curious. Curiosity in AI is the best way to learn, getting hands-on with the tools and technology, both in a professional but also personal life stance. Asking questions, seeing the output. You really, you don't need to be a data scientist or have an AI background, but you will need to be AI literate moving forward, understanding how it works, what it can do, particularly in your space, your industry, your role, how are other people using it. AI is going to be increasingly a collaborator for people in their roles, but it's not a competitor, and the value lies in being able to steer it and get the best from it. I think, as Jeff and Liam have touched on, is the importance of SMEs. Like, AI isn't going to replace you. Very much, if anything, the need for human SME knowledge is growing with the use of AI. But we need SMEs who can use AI to be able to find that sweet spot balance and validate those outputs. So just roll up your sleeves and get hands-on.
Yeah. I'll echo one thing that Charlotte said about it being professional and personal. Like, think about AI. I would offer, be a little bit selfish, be personalized. Like, how is this going to help me in growth in what I do, and not just in this role, but my career and my life? Because there's going to be continuous motion, and we can be overwhelmed by the demands of many people. And I don't want to encourage people to be selfish people. However, in order to sort of eliminate that noise, get to the specific context of the work and the growth that you have, and focus on that. And I would also sort of within how you think about it, use the tools. Don't forget the human side. I've seen many people talking about when AI sort of does become more ubiquitous, the things that are going to be human advantage are EQ and empathy and intrinsic motivation and understanding communications and learning. And so don't lose sight of that as you think about how these tools can fold into your practice. It's not a wholesale change. It's just something to potentially enhance what you do.
That was great. Thank you, Jeff and Charlotte. Hopefully some inspiration regarding where we can start focusing, so we're ready for the future and we move from the user seat maybe into the co-designer seat on where we're applying AI. On that note, thank you for all your super interesting questions. We'll do our best to cover as many as possible. Let's kick off, and I feel that maybe Liam is best placed to answer this because it relates to behavioral biases. So we have spoken about AI influencing human behavior. Do we have any insight into how human behavior can influence AI, leading to issues such as biased answers from AI? I'm thinking maybe something about AI augmenting and increasing human biases, and also vice versa. Do you have some insight there, Liam?
Yeah, and again, across the different types of AI, there's different ways of doing it. I would say, like, let me just pick one because there's just so many. Like, a very simple one is just behavioral disclosure. Like, I've had a lot of students work on this, and it's fast how it'll happen. At the moment, like, you type something into the chatbot, it comes up with all this really plausible sounding text, and then somewhere in the small print it says, we could be talking nonsense. You take your own chance with this. And we have no idea really how people respond to those disclaimers or how they should be framed, or whether there's perverse effects of disclosure. And at the moment, nobody really cares that much because everyone's basically frightened by how fast the technology is moving and isn't calming down sufficiently to go, look, you're providing information to people. There should be standard ways to explain to people how they should use this information and so on. And I think that will be a big part of behavioral design, will be stop thinking about LLM production, which is beyond most of our capacity to even understand what the engineers are doing with those, and start thinking about behavioral endpoints, things that people are reading to make a decision, and get our brains back into that. Like, what's the actual behavioral interface of what comes out of it as it hits the human being? And I think behavioral science is absolutely pivotal there. And that's the right, by the way, sorry, the final thing I say is I think that's the right interface for the financial industry as well, which is what are your users seeing or your customers seeing, and how is it influencing their decisions?
Thank you, Liam. That's very insightful. Another good question in here is the behaviors that are required for adoption, experiment, and challenge, collaborate, which are the behaviors that I suggested in the intro. Well done. How do you measure whether these are present in the organization and which is preventing adoption? I think that's a great question, because whatever you measure is what you can manage. So if you're not able to measure these behaviors, how are you going to check on adoption? On the introduction slide, I highlighted that we can use behavioral insights to make sure that these behaviors are present or not. Ironically, you could even use AI these days in order to check. For instance, if you're using AI to draft minutes, that would be light adoption. But if you want to have deep adoption, you could also use AI to analyze who has spoken up. Say you're having a conversation about AI adoption, and you could assess who spoke up, who was quiet, what type of challenge. You could also get insight as to what initiatives are being driven out of the speaking up opportunities or the challenges, and if that is driving innovation. Because connected to the grand finale question to the panel, we were also saying, how could you lean into that in order to take further the use of AI as a tool to drive us to where our vision lies? I don't know if any of our panelists have any other insight as to how we can measure this type of behaviors as preventing or enabling.
I would just say that a challenge like this is not just based upon adoption of one tool. An organization that has looked across a long period of time at how change and new tools has been successfully or unsuccessfully rolled out will be the one that benefits. That this at the moment is just another, like, I don't want to understand, it's another thing to adopt and ask people to change how they work. And if you've collected data and made observations over the course of many years about how people respond, that will benefit you. That you can't come in cold, never having thought about how people are going to adopt a change and try to really have analysis, or you take a survey. So it's not to say don't try, you got to start sometime. But I think that, like, you have to have a longitudinal approach to it, because it's not just a single transaction in order to determine people's attitudes and trends.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. Exactly.
Adding to that, one of the things we see is that's actually something we're asked quite commonly from clients. How do we know if we've been successful once we've rolled out? How do we measure adoption? And, what they don't like to hear, and understandably in the FS space, is some of it is unquantifiable, in a sense of it is, how do you quantify success? Is it the number of times people use it? Is that, an indication of adoption? Is it how much of the use translate into time saving? That's kind of a value creation, but actually trying to measure adoption can be quite challenging compared to some different areas where metrics are quite clear cut. But a huge amount about it is, how often are people obviously using it? As Jeff says, you can run surveys, you can track certain metrics, and you can start to watch trends and behaviors, but it's definitely a topical area.
Great, thank you, Charlotte. So looking at time, you have too many interesting questions. I don't think we can cover them all. I'll make time for two more, maybe one with 2-minute answer and one quick 1-minute answer, and then we have time to wrap up. So question, in what areas of financial services have you seen the most tangible impact from combining behavioral science and AI? For example, in client engagement, risk management, or product optimization. Any insights from our panel? I think it was a great shortlist, actually. So I'll kick us off. From my perspective, I would say that we're definitely missing a trick if we don't see the benefit in both audiences, our clients, but also our employees. How can we make it easier for our clients to engage with us? So AI is already being used to retrieve their feedback. So that is the way that we're using AI. Is it helping them? If it's not, we need to look into that so we can tweak it. So that's a great synergy between behavioral science and AI. And then internally, I will piggyback on what Jeff was saying regarding applications, for example, in wealth management. I am personally super excited about the promise of agentic AI. If we can set up AI to give insight to advisors at the right time with personalized advice, looking at their own profile and our client, we will facilitate their job and free them up to do higher value work. So I think both of them are essential, and that crosses over into risk management because you're essentially reducing the risk of mis-selling and enhancing the product that you're delivering to the customer. Any other insight?
I think one thing I would just add to that, Martha, is what we're seeing with clients is very much moved to that, bringing people on the journey earlier, bringing SMEs into that, co-designing, co-building from the start, in order to intersect that behavioral science and AI piece much earlier on than just trying to drive changes once toolings have been built and rolled out. So that's a real shift that we're starting to see from those lessons learned.
That's great, thank you. And one last final short question that will probably end with a cliffhanger. Jeff, are you collaborating with universities or research institutions to explore this intersection between behavioral science and AI?
We are. What a great question. I'm actually really excited that I've managed to get my voice heard and say, let's just not barrel into things, but let's really study it as best we can. And so we're working with a leading research institution located somewhere on the East Coast of the United States. And we're going to hope to have some results looking in next spring, and then maybe we can come back here. And it's essentially, like I've banged the drum all for the hour, it's a tool, not a solution. How can we use AI to help advisors help their clients, not to replace advisors or to go direct to the clients, but how can we identify those moments and those things that is really where the need is greatest for some sort of intervention, and how can we frame that? And cliffhanger, stay tuned, and I would love to come back to this group and talk about it when we're able.
I personally cannot wait to hear how that goes. Thanks for keeping us on the loop. Okay, so it's time to wrap up. Time flies when you're having fun. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. If you would like to hear more, we have QR codes in case you want to scan them and find out more about behavioral science and AI thought leadership. Also, please feel free to get in touch with Charlotte and me if we can answer more of your questions. And thank you so much for your time. I think it was a brilliant conversation, and I'm excited to continue. Yes, you can see our emails on the screen. And if we move on, you can see the QR codes in case you're interested to learn more virtually. And big thank you to our panelists. I think you did a brilliant job. I know you're super busy, so thank you for being here. And thank you again to our audience for dialing in around the world, your super insightful questions, your attention, and for the interest in the future of work in this interesting intersection and vital intersection between behavioral science and AI. Look forward to keeping in touch. Have a great rest of your day.